Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our monthly program at the Silco. We appreciate your joining us on this lovely Saturday morning. I know that some of you are heading after this straight over to the Fiesta and Moss for the chocolate throw and the other festivities, food, music, performances in Santa Clara. And some people are heading out to the Silver City football game. Our team is playing Lovington and they may go to the playoffs. There's a lot going on in our town and we really appreciate you joining us here for the Silver City Museum's monthly community conversation. These programs are co-sponsored by the museum and by WIL, the Western Institute of Lifelong Learning, and by LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. Today we have Dr. Doug Dinwiddie presenting on the topic of frontier justice. He will take us into the early Wild West era of Grant County. I'm Kathleen Norman. I'm the programs coordinator for the Silver City Museum. And this is the third of 3 programs this fall dealing with government. In the spring, we will continue exploring different aspects of Silver City's essential history, Silver 101, under the topic of community building. We invite you to the museum's Christmas celebration. December 10th is Victorian Christmas and more. There will be food and music and gift opportunities. And then in February, we'll have the Territorial Charter Ball, February 11th. So we have many wonderful things coming up for you from the museum. I'd like to thank the museum staff and the volunteers who all pitched in to bring you this program. It indeed has been an effort, and we always enjoy bringing these programs to you. The program is free, but we do suggest a $5 donation. If you have a little extra change in your pocket, we'd appreciate it. If you're interested in joining the museum, there are membership forms up front. We love our volunteers and we're always welcoming more of them. And I'd like to start out now with a little bit of housekeeping. Please mute your cell phones. The bathrooms are on the right-hand side. And while we're using the microphone, we have a policy of wait until the microphone comes to you. And that is so that our people who are listening remotely on Facebook and on Zoom can hear the question and answer. So the program consists of Dr. Dinwiddie presenting on frontier justice. Then we'll have a brief pause. And after that, we'll have questions and answers with Dr. Dinwiddie. And then we'll have a panel discussion. We'll have Judge Foy and we'll have Spencer Baca. So, frontier justice. Laws and law enforcement were often an afterthought in young Grant County. Silver City gained its courthouse in 1878. And as the county seat grew, there were judges, justices, and juries who came into play for a range of local matters, mining claim disputes, cattle range conflicts, standard criminal offenses, and the occasional brutal murder. A seasoned educator, Professor Dinwiddie draws from his extensive study and teaching expertise in 19th century topics. Doug grew up in Pinos Altos and graduated from the Silver Consolidated Schools. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in history from WNMU and his PhD in history and political science from Northern Arizona University. From 1974 to 1987, he served as curator, then director of the WNM Museum. He held the position of professor of social science at the Carlsbad branch of New Mexico State University for 22 years. After a brief stint in Colorado, he returned to his home ground here in Silver City, and he's been involved at the Fort Bayard for 7 years. He's presently the president of the Fort Bayard Historical Preservation Society. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Dinwiddie.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's very nice to have the opportunity to speak with you today. Good to see a lot of familiar faces and some that I'm not as familiar with, but hope to get to know you as well. Today, we're going to just scratch the surface on the frontier justice system in Grant County. There's enough to look at that we could go on for many hours, but they say that I should do this in 45 minutes. So we're going to take a quick look at it. And if you have some questions afterwards, we'll look forward to trying to answer those for you. I am not advancing my slide here, folks. There we go. All right, good. Thank you. Of course, frontier justice brings up the immediate thought of not all of it took place in the courtroom. And certainly Grant County had its share of things going on that were extra legal. And so let's talk about a couple of definitions here. One definition of the frontier, the place where civilization meets the wilderness, the edge of settlement. In 1890, a scholar presented a paper at the conference, and this scholar was Frederick Jackson Turner, who is recognized as one of the great Western historians. And in fact, his paper presented what came to be called the frontier thesis. And basically, he argued that the frontier was closing in America in 1890, that it existed no more. Well, I would argue that New Mexico never got the memo, and the frontier certainly persisted well beyond 1890 in New Mexico. But one of the quotes from Frederick Jackson Turner that we'll be kind of coming back to, for a moment at the frontier, the bonds of custom are broken and unrestraint is triumphant. So what's justice? Well, there are many different definitions of justice. This is only one. But Mark Twain had this to say. So let's look at New Mexico specifically now. This gentleman on the screen here is Edmund Ross. He served as territorial governor in New Mexico, 1885 to 89. Ross was mentioned in John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage because it was Ross's vote in the Senate that had actually saved Andrew Johnson from being removed from office when he was impeached. And later on, of course, that was in the late 1860s. And later on, Ross comes to New Mexico as the appointed governor. Bear in mind that territorial governors were appointed by the president. They were not elected. And Ross, after he arrives in New Mexico, had this to say. Rings of almost every description grew up till the affairs of the territory came to be run almost exclusively for the benefit of combinations of ambitious and unscrupulous Americans. There's another territorial governor that had a quote that I've always been rather fond of, and that was Lew Wallace, who said that experience anywhere else in the world is of no value in New Mexico. So let's talk a minute about this thing with the rings before we go on. The most notorious and powerful of the so-called rings was the Santa Fe ring in the state or territorial capital. And the most powerful person in that ring was Thomas B. Catron. But he had other associates. They were up to their neck in the Lincoln County War and lots of other territorial disputes in New Mexico. Catron, by the way, is estimated to have controlled 12 million acres in New Mexico at one time. And here in the Southwest, Grant County had been created in 1868. And of course, our mines in Grant County were producing a tremendous amount of wealth for the territory of New Mexico. And the early settlers in this area, Silver City comes into existence in 1870. And so it's only 2 years after Grant County was created. And the people of this part of the state or the territory were pretty annoyed that the Santa Fe ring pretty much ignored this region and took it for granted, and needs and desires of the people of this section were ignored. And so in 1876, there was a very strong movement for Grant County to secede from the territory of New Mexico and to attach itself to the neighboring territory of Arizona. And Arizona was fairly friendly to that idea. And it eventually was shot down by the Territorial Committee in the US Congress, and Grant County was not able to secede, but at least they got the attention of the Santa Fe ring. And as a result, Silver City was granted the permission by the territorial legislature to create its own charter, which was perfected in 1878 and adopted. And from 1878 forward, Silver City has operated under this unique document. And it had all come about largely because of the secession movement that the Santa Fe powers had decided that in order to keep this prosperous area of the territory, they needed to throw Grant County a bone. And the bone was the charter. And as a result, Grant County is going to have a number of unique features that are not really found elsewhere in the territory. Now, one thing to think about as we examine the justice system is just the vastness of the territory that had to be administered. You notice that it mentions here on the slide roughly the size of Massachusetts. As created, Grant County included the present day counties, not only of Grant County, but it also included the territory that later became Hidalgo County and Luna County. Over 10,000 square miles. So the 1880 census counted 4,530 individuals in Grant County. So about 1/2 person per square mile. Need a lawman? Good luck finding him. Now, one of the interesting outcomes of the city of the charter that Silver City was able to adopt in 1878 is, among other things, it created the office of city marshal. And so you had city marshal and the Grant County sheriff. And jurisdictional questions came up then from time to time as to whose problem is X event. And it wasn't a problem that was always easily resolved. And I'm sure our panel may today talk a little bit about that jurisdictional issues may still be an issue at times in the justice system. Now, you may recall that Frederick Jackson Turner had written about unrestraint becoming triumphant on the frontier. Here are the tools of unrestraint. Add some of this to the mix, and you have the predictable outcomes. I remember taking a tour in Lincoln County one time in the community of Lincoln, which was, of course, notorious for its frontier violence. And our historian guide mentioned the fact that, in his opinion, practically everybody in the Lincoln County War was drunk most of the time. And while we don't have any statistics about that in Grant County, I think we can probably assume that quite a bit of the time, some of the people involved had that issue as well. Now, I want to take a minute here to just mention the source of some of our information. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a man by the name of Lou Blatchley, who had moved here after he retired from government service. He was a native of the Western Slope in Colorado, but he had developed respiratory ailments, and the doctors advised him if he came back west that he needed to go to a place less cold and less wet than the Western Slope of Colorado. So he had relocated here in Silver City, and he was a man of considerable intellectual energy. And he took a job with the weekly newspaper, the Silver City Enterprise, and his main job was selling ads. But he soon became interested in the stories that he kept hearing from old timers. And he started writing a series of articles that appeared in the Silver City Enterprise starting in 1949. And for a while, he traveled around southwestern New Mexico in the company of a stenographer who would keep notes on the interviews that he was doing with old timers. That became prohibitively expensive by the time he paid the stenographer, and somebody suggested to him that maybe he should use one of these newfangled instruments that were just coming into the hands of the public, the tape recorder. Apparently, there was one tape recorder in Silver City at that time, and it belonged to Eddie Ward, who was the manager of the Gila Theater, competitor of the Silco. And Eddie Ward was persuaded by Lou Blatchley to loan him his tape recorder. And that was the beginning. And over the next several years, Blatchley filled over 800 reel-to-reel tapes with the recollections of about 100 old timers, not only in the Silver City area, but he went as far afield as West Texas and northern Arizona to capture the recollections. So some of the stories I'll be sharing with you today are thanks to the work of Lou Blatchley, who was one of the earliest of what we today call oral historians. And I also want to take time to just mention that my work in the area with preserving those tapes and the information on them was when I left the area for another position in the late 1980s. Pat Humble and Terry Humble kind of picked up the task, and we owe a lot to the Humbles for what they did to preserve and protect the information that Lou Blatchley had gathered. By the way, the original tapes were taken to the University of New Mexico's Zimmerman Library. And it's a long, long story about getting copies of them available here. So I won't go into that, but I just want to talk about some of the information that was captured in those tapes. One of the quotes from Marvin Poe, who was a cowboy who had worked for several ranches in New Mexico in the late 1800s and early 1900s, was this quote from him that it was nothing to see a man killed in them days. And Poe went on to recount the killings of at least 14 men that he had witnessed. The survivors of the scrapes would sometimes find themselves in need of legal counsel now. And this is just an example from a Silver City newspaper in the 1890s. Thought it's interesting here. We have ads from 13 different barristers in the newspaper. By contrast, there was one dentist and 4 doctors who had bought ads. So I suppose we could extrapolate that you're 13 times more likely to need a lawyer than a dentist. Now, who were the frontier lawyers? Oftentimes, these are people with not a great deal of legal background. The typical way you became a lawyer on the frontier was to, of course, pass the territorial bar examination. And you prepare for that oftentimes by doing what was called reading law. And reading law would oftentimes involve being a clerk in a practicing attorney's office and carrying out duties that in some instances today are carried out by paralegals, et cetera. You know, Abraham Lincoln never went to law school. Abraham Lincoln was, remember, self-taught, and he read law in an attorney's office in Springfield, Illinois, and eventually, of course, became a well-known lawyer in that state. So it was pretty typical that people would get into the law that way. According to one source I was looking at, by the 1850s, it's estimated that there may have been a dozen law books in the entire territory of New Mexico. And so a lot of it was sort of best guess. By the time we get to the Silver City era and the town charter and so forth, things were looking up a little, but it still was quite common to have people practicing law who with very little formal training in the law. Then, of course, you have frontier judges. This is a painting of the famous Judge Roy Bean's headquarters over in West Texas. And you notice that the courtroom is a saloon. And a lot of Bean's decisions have been written up by historians. And one of the things that Bean did that I'm sure a lot of other frontier judges were obliged to take account of as well, is Bean would always look around the courtroom during, as the trial's proceedings commenced, and determine who all was in the courtroom to support whom, and most of them were armed. And so the judge would kind of know what the odds were as the trial proceeded, as to what maybe his decision should be. And there's a famous case with Bean that had involved the killing of a Chinese railroad worker. And he'd been killed by a white man, and the defendant was in the courtroom with a lot of his friends sporting their weapons. And when Judge Bean handed down his decision, he said that he had consulted his law books and he found numerous references to the killing of individuals, but not a one of them addressed the killing of a Chinaman. So he declared the man not guilty. Then there's the case here in New Mexico territory where a judge had given a pretty good dressing down to the lawyers in the room. And one of the lawyers replied, "Your Honor, don't be too hard on the lawyers. You may be one yourself someday." All right, well, what about the lawmen who are tasked to enforce the law? Silver City was blessed with a pretty capable lawman throughout most of its territorial period. And the most well-known of them was Harvey Whitehill. Whitehill was a very early resident of Silver City, came here in its earliest days, and through likability and ability, he was soon elevated to the position of sheriff. And he and his chief deputy became kind of the territorial version of the good cop, bad cop situation. And his chief deputy was Dan Tucker throughout much of the time. Now, Dan Tucker was known as Dangerous Dan Tucker. He sometimes was also called Shotgun Dan Tucker because of his preferred weapon. And writer Bob Alexander, who's written books on both Whitehill and Dan Tucker, states that by Tucker's own count, he was obliged to kill 8 men in Grant County alone. And these incidents are documented. There was one case here in Silver City where a fellow had been chunking rocks at passersby. And some of those rocks had found their mark, and Tucker went out to address the situation, and the guy threw a rock while Tucker was confronting him, so Tucker killed him. And so you learned you didn't throw rocks in Silver City. On another occasion, remembering now that Deming was still part of Grant County until after 1900, and Dan Tucker was sent to Deming because of the need for a lawman there. And he went there, and there was one cowboy who had ridden his horse into the Harvey house and was shooting through the ceiling and generally creating mayhem. And Dan Tucker walked in and blew him away with his shotgun. And they said Deming got a lot calmer after that. So definitely Tucker was one of these fellows not to be trifled with. Now, about courthouses, the first courthouse in Grant County was in Santa Clara. In those days, it was called Central City or just Central. And it had grown up to serve Fort Bayard. And the first courthouse in Grant County was there, and it still stands today. And it's on Maple Street. And by the way, if you ever want to walk around historic Santa Clara, you can go in the city hall there and pick up a copy of the Santa Clara walking tour. And it'll guide you around to a number of the historic buildings in the village, including this courthouse. Second courthouse was in Pinos Altos. This building still stands as well. It's a private residence. It sits right next to Bear Creek. And many of you are familiar with the Buckhorn Restaurant Saloon. And if you go about 400 yards north from the Buckhorn, you will come to this building. And yeah, again, it was the second courthouse in Grant County. When the county seat was moved here to Silver City, at first they rented various spaces around to serve as the courtrooms. But in 1885, as a sign of its growing prosperity, Silver City constructed a courthouse that stood on the site of today's courthouse, which replaced it starting in 1929. And the cost of this building, as you see, was just over $22,000. Well, sometimes justice in the eyes of the community was not to be carried out according to the rules. And there were times that people thought the wheels of justice were moving far too slowly. An example, again, an area that's no longer part of Grant County, but was then, the town of Shakespeare. In 1881, you have two horse thieves who had been incarcerated in the jail waiting for the circuit judge to appear, and a mob decided that they weren't going to wait, and they strung up these two outlaws, Sandy King and Russian Bill, and did it right there in the Grant Hotel in Shakespeare. Now, lynchings didn't always go according to plan. Gary Larson in The Far Side had one version of what might happen. Things went wrong. But the story of Joel Fowler, and it's recounted in the Blatchley interviews. Man by the name of Montague Stevens, who wrote a book called Meet Mr. Grizzly. And Montague Stevens was in his 90s when Blatchley interviewed him, and he was an eyewitness to the lynching of Joel Fowler. Joel Fowler was a notorious killer who some people estimate had killed dozens of men, often on a contract hit basis. And Fowler had murdered a man in cold blood in a saloon in Socorro in front of witnesses, and had been incarcerated in the Socorro jail, which had a dirt floor. And it was reported that Joel Fowler had almost escaped by digging a hole in his cell floor and had almost made it when he was discovered. And some of the citizens of Socorro decided that that was a real security risk. And so they decided to go ahead and take care of the Joel Fowler situation before it got out of hand anymore. So a mob got Fowler. They took him down to the local hanging tree in Socorro. They stood him up in the back of a wagon and they drove the wagon off. And when Joel Fowler fell, it was discovered that somebody had miscalculated the distance. And Joel Fowler landed on his tiptoes. So rather than recover the wagon and start all over again, somebody got the idea, if we just pick up his feet and then a bunch of other guys jump on him, that'll get the job done. And so Montague Stevens said he witnessed that's exactly how they finished the job on Joel Fowler. By the way, just speaking of jails and jail security, jails were not particularly secure. And you may know that Billy the Kid escaped from the Silver City jail by climbing out the chimney. And his first of many escapes. Now, in 1883, there is an incident at Gage. Gage is circled here on this map. The Southern Pacific Railroad had completed its transcontinental path through Deming and onto the West Coast in 1880. Silver City got its railroad 3 years later when a spur came up from Deming to Silver City. Of course, trains had introduced a brand new temptation for outlaws, for robbery. And there's a robbery of the train at Gage in November of 1883 that also resulted in the murder of the engineer on the train. For a while, there was a mystery about who the perpetrators were, but through a series of clues, Sheriff Whitehill was able to track down one at a time the members of the gang. And the leader of the gang was an outlaw by the name of Kit Joy. And Kit Joy and 3 others were eventually put in jail here in Silver City and charged with robbery and the murder of the engineer. But in March of 1884, they broke out of the jail and they went to the nearby Elephant Corral, which was on Hudson Street, and secured horses and headed out, escaping from town. But by then somebody had noticed and there were shots fired after them. And soon there was a posse on the trail. They chased these 4 outlaws to the east a ways, and then they turned north toward the Pinos Altos Mountains. They chased them further, eventually caught up with them. And in the ensuing gunfight, 1 member of the posse was killed, and 3 members of the outlaw gang were killed, but not Kit Joy. Kit Joy himself survived to be brought back to jail, convicted, and sentenced to prison. And Kit Joy eventually serves about 11 years before he was eventually released from prison and lived out his life as a free man. Fort Bayard had introduced a whole different element into the region. You have all the soldiers out there, and some of them came to Silver City to party, but most of them went to the nearby village of Central City, as Santa Clara was known then. And Central City became rather notorious for its criminal activity. And one of the events that happens out there in 1885 is a man who had been awarded the Medal of Honor for previous work in Arizona. He and a fellow soldier had a dispute over a lady of the evening. And the soldier who felt offended and disappointed had shot Sergeant Bowman. And his defense was that it was an accidental shooting, that his gun fell out of his hand and hit the ground. Well, the jury didn't buy it. And he was convicted of killing Bowman. But one of the most interesting aspects of this trial that was reported in the local papers was the hungry juror who said that he really wasn't that convinced of the Private O'Donnell's guilt, but he was hungry. It was supper time, and it seemed to him they were never going to get supper unless they reached a verdict. So he said, so that he could eat supper, he said he voted guilty also. But sounds like a appealable conviction there. But anyhow, O'Donnell eventually is sentenced to jail, and he's released after 8 years. Then there's the story of Ada Holmes. Ada was a piano player in the Monarch Saloon in Silver City, and she became infatuated with a man by the name of Jack Brown. Unfortunately for Ada, Jack was married and had children, in fact. And Jack eventually got around to telling Ada that he couldn't be with her. He was going to have to stay with his wife. So Ada was not happy, and she took a pistol to the Centennial Saloon where Jack was known to frequent. And in front of many witnesses, she shot Jack and killed him. Ada was then convicted of murder in a courtroom in Silver City, and was sentenced to 3 years. And the editor of the Lordsburg Liberal newspaper said that this was an outrage, and that in his opinion, Ada should have been tried by Judge Lynch. Ada eventually became a newspaper sensation in the territorial penitentiary in Santa Fe. She was the only female inmate at the time, and later is reported to have had affairs with the warden and the assistant warden at the state pen. Eventually, Ada was released, and her last known address was Creede, Colorado. And nobody knows what became of her after that. Today, if you want to go online and look up this episode on Investigation Discovery Channel, Deadly Women Lovers Make Three. It's a 3-parter that deals with 3 different incidents in the United States. And one of them is the Ada Holmes story. So even today, the story of Ada Holmes is still being talked about. And when you tune that in, I will advise you ahead of time that you'll have to believe that Silver City sits among the Saguaros. One of the often discussed issues is there really just one justice system, or is there justice for people depending on who they are? And an example of this in the 1890s was the well-known and some would say notorious cattleman Tom Lyons, who shot and killed his wife's lover in their living room here in Silver City. And it was quickly decided that this was justifiable homicide, and Tom was exonerated for this killing. But of course, the barroom pianist had gotten 3 years. Here's an example of an attorney who actually shot and killed the town marshal. His name was Fielder, and the town marshal, Cantley, had been loud and abusive toward the attorney in a local watering hole, and the testimony was that the town marshal had it coming. And so the lawyer was quickly exonerated for shooting and killing Marshal Cantley. Then there's the story of Tom Darnell. Again, this is a story that is told in the Blatchley tapes. Darnell was a cowboy who had been recruited, had signed up for the Rough Riders. And in fact, he became known as the best bronco buster in the Rough Riders. And in Teddy Roosevelt's book about the Rough Riders, there's a photo of Tom Darnell riding a bronc. And Roosevelt praises him effusively as being the best horseman he had ever seen. But Tom Darnell was also a mean man. And that's how he was described by people who talked about him to Blatchley. One witness said that Tom Darnell was a real wampus cat, and he was always stirring up a fuss. And Darnell's end came in a bar in Central. He had just been fired from his job as a cowboy in the Diamond A for threatening other cowboys, and was drowning his sorrows at the bar in Central, and became angry at the bartender and decided that he was going to kill him. And he had left his weapon out on on a horse outside. So Darnell goes out and he straps on his pistol, comes back into the room, and now the bartender has run away, but the proprietor of the saloon is now behind the bar. And Darnell asks him, "Where'd that so-and-so go? I'm going to kill him." And he said, "No, you're not. You're not going to kill anybody." And he tried to give Darnell a bottle and just tell him to leave. And Darnell said, "Well, I guess I'll just have to kill you then." And Darnell reached down and grabbed his sweater. It was in the month of February. It was cold. He was wearing a thick, heavy sweater. As he pulled the pistol from its holster, he hung the hammer of the pistol in his sweater. And while he was attempting to dislodge it, the saloon keeper retrieved his own weapon from under the bar and shot and killed Tom Darnell. Again, justifiable homicide, since Darnell was trying to kill him. Well, statehood comes finally in 1912, and New Mexico is admitted as the 47th state. I know all of us have experiences where we run into people who haven't got the message on that, but it truly did occur. And as part of becoming a state, New Mexico had to adopt a new constitution, which established a new system of laws and courts in New Mexico, and it was now ready to move on to its next phase. And that is going to use the available time I have today to talk a little bit about early law in Silver City.
Okay.
But
Well, starting with part 2 of our program, we've got questions and answers with our speaker, Doug Dinwiddie. And just a reminder about microphone etiquette, please wait to speak until we hand you the microphone, and that's for the benefit of the people who are listening remotely on Zoom and Facebook. So who's going to start off with a question about frontier justice?
Very interesting stuff. Thank you, Doug. I wonder, you didn't mention any Hispanic murderers or victims and so on. Was this sort of stuff going on among the Hispanic population of the territory as well?
Yes, it was. And in fact, one of the aspects of frontier justice, there was a deep element of racism in it. And in fact, some of the people that Dan Tucker killed were Hispanics. The population was often, of course, it's not unusual that Silver City was like most Western communities, that the dominant political organization, including your constables and sheriffs and marshals and so forth, were dominated by the Anglo group. And even the newspapers that reported things oftentimes treated the Spanish-speaking population as invisible, basically. And a lot of what went on with them was never even recorded.
Yeah, my experience with the newspapers here, they were edited by and for Anglos, and they generally just did not report news about Hispanics at all.
Right.
For example, during the influenza epidemic of 1918, 1919, they just didn't report Hispanic deaths. Practically all the deaths reported in those newspapers, the Enterprise and the Independent then, were just in the Anglo communities. So, and there was no Spanish language newspaper in Grant
Right.
County to fill in those gaps. So all of that is just lost to history, essentially.
Yeah, and you'll notice that in other parts of the territory, for example, in Las Vegas, New Mexico, there was and in Santa Fe, there were Spanish language newspapers. That did not exist in the southern part of the territory.
Even Lou Blatchley, I mean, his stuff is great, and I hope it will be used more than it has been. But even there, he interviewed maybe 3 Hispanic people,
Right.
or 4, something like that. So even with him talking to the old timers in the 50s,
Right.
there is still that blank space.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
Another question?
Doug, great presentation. And I was curious about mining because Josiah Royce, in his dissertation from Cal Berkeley, he's a philosopher in Harvard later on, wrote a terrific book about the claim jumping in California during the 1848 gold rush, and had the U.S. Mining Act changed that, and as a result, did Grant County have the problems of claim jumping and irregularities in the mining districts that existed in California and Nevada?
I don't know enough about those other places to compare them, but I can tell you that it was still an issue. And generally anything that involves profit and money is going to invite conflict. And oftentimes the mining claims were an issue. And again, I think from my research anyway, a lot of it is not much has been written in that. There's probably room for some scholarship to look into that more in this area, because certainly the resources I'm aware of don't deal that much with that aspect of it. But it certainly was still an issue. And in fact, it was mentioned to me at the break that perhaps one of the reasons we find so many lawyers in Silver City was not because they were all defending murderers, but that a lot of them were probably involved in mining issues and mining claims and land litigation and that sort of thing. So I think, again, I think that's an aspect of it that could use some further investigation.
Good question. Anybody else have another question?
What about the What about a comparison of the violence pre-Civil War, frontier violence pre-Civil War compared to post-Civil War? I suspect that there was some post-traumatic stress disorders among the soldiers that fought in the war.
You know, that's a good point, but I think that of course, in the case of New Mexico, we have Grant County, for example, doesn't even exist prior to the Civil War. It comes into being afterwards. But if you look at the territory as a whole and the West as a whole, it would be hard to imagine that the situation was particularly better before the Civil War. One thing is just the number of people. And the more people that you had in a region.
Interesting, there's a lot of cattle seed. Oh, yes. I just ended a lot of conventional cattle rusters back in my day, and we do get some of those cases. And I haven't seen a horse stealing case, to be honest with you, ever. But there's been a lot of cattle stealing. We actually have like the cattle inspector, and they go to great lengths to try to make sure we don't have a lot of cases. There's so often, there'll be cases that come through on cattle arrest and that kind of thing. We have your bar shootouts that happen. That happens here, Danny Ward. You have all that kind of thing. Right now, really, in all honesty, everything is very substantive. Everything right now is incredibly substantive. Yeah, there's two judges here in Silver City. There's me and there's just two. And we are handling here at this point 294 felony cases of filed at this time. By the end of the year, probably over 300. I would anecdotally, I haven't sat down like I would do if I was interested in doing some kind of solid paper, real research. Come from that I spent but I can tell you anecdotally that I would say 70% of the people that I see in criminal cases involving felony this issue, I think are either substance abuse related, alcohol related cases, and that's just the way it is.
Sheriff Gomez was quoted in the recent Citizen Press as saying he was responding to some criticism about a high school case that happened recently. And he mentioned that it was involved with catching the youth program. So I'm interested in your opinion, Your Honor, and on that.
I didn't read that article or keep up with that at all.
Well, it's not about that group story, just about the legality of the program that he's blamed for a lot of the.
I'm gonna give you my.
Should we rephrase the question?
That's okay, I think I call the balls when I call this. I call it the way I see it. Sometimes people don't agree with the way I see that. Most times my quorum is 50%. Okay, but that's our position. There's gotta be someone when we have to do rather than going out in the street like they did back in the day, pulling out their guns and killing each other. There's gotta be someone who can say, no, this is what we have to do. And that's me. Better or worse, that's what it is. All right. Catch and release is a term in my mind that is brought forth for political purpose. All right. And I'm not a politician. I'm a judge. And what I tell people is this: you make the law. You tell me what the law is, and I'll apply it. That's what I do. Now, historically, I'm going to tell you about this catch and release. Historically, people in the United States follow the cash bond system. Right? And that is that if you get accused of a crime, a cash bond is set on you. And if you get out, if you want to get out of jail, you've got to set up the bond. Cash bond or surety bond and so forth. So cash bond or get a bond historically. Okay. That's in New Mexico, that's tremendously on. Yeah, because it's changed, because the theory behind it was that just because you're poor, you shouldn't get jail. We need to go to a risk-based method of determining who gets it and who doesn't from jail pre-conviction. And keep in mind pre-conviction. I didn't make these rules. You know, America lives by the adage of we are innocent until we are proven guilty. I didn't make, that's not my rule, that's the way it is. All right. And so we decided we don't want to put people into custody before they're convicted. You want to change that, change it. That's fine. You tell me what the rules are, I'll apply it. Okay. But that's the start. All right. So once we start with that, then we think there are people who need not be out and about in public, even though they haven't been convicted, because the charges are serious, they're very dangerous. So there are rules that we take into account in determining who should be released, should not. For the most part, ladies and gentlemen, most everybody gets released. Out of those 394 cases, there are very few cases where people are not released. All right. Now, if I had a crystal ball and I could tell you this guy wasn't going to go out and do something in the future, I wouldn't let that guy. That's it. Right? I knew if I had the foresight, I wouldn't do that. But I don't. I don't know people. All I can do is take information that's given to me and make a decision. And the rule is, unless you're dangerous, there's a process that we're not going to be tested. And so when they talk about catch and release, is people get arrested for crimes, they go in front of the magistrate, not me, Jim. Case who starts in magistrate. And then the magistrate sets an unsecured bond with condition of release. Including now we have cross services that actually watch so that's the system that we're under. And I have held people pre-conviction that I believe are dangerous. I have done that. But I have released many more because, frankly, that's the system. And what I tell people is when they blame you make the rule, you tell me what the rule is. All I'm doing is apply the law. See it? And I wish I had heard it all, and tell you what I can't. And so things happen, you know, there are, but there's. People who commit crimes and first came from even after they get released. I can tell you, I don't know lots of district judges, I mean, already. And there's not one of them that doesn't take this job seriously. There's not one of them that doesn't want to be released, committed another crime. They have the information available to them and they make the best. And so I can only tell you that's how I go about doing it. You know, I don't make any rules, I just take what I'm given and I need to see.
Yeah, and to add a bit, I think I've been living under a rock. Talking about bail, I've never heard of the person. But just to build on what Judge Point said, I think that two aspects that people have to remember, right, is that number one, to keep somebody incarcerated through trial, right? That is a very tough thing, like you mentioned, with the presumption of innocence, which is a constitutional right that, you know, it has to be balanced, and it is a very important right. So when you're first arrested, you're only accused of crime, right? And I think the second thing is that if you look at bail, you know, throughout the years, state to state and federally, it tends to go in cycles because there is no perfect system of guessing who, or not guessing, but assuming who is so dangerous that we need to keep them behind bars and who can go and live a reasonable life awaiting trial. How do we ensure that they're going to show back up for trial? How do we ensure that they're not going to go and get more from? Right? And I think that with any legislative or regulatory action, there's always going to be winners and losers, right? I mean, there is no perfect legislation or regulation to address that issue. There's going to be people that get the short end of the stick. It's going to be an injustice. They're going to be detained, you know, unjustly or unfairly, or there's going to be people that get out and go and commit other heinous crimes, right? And just last thing, I think that there's been a few studies done, and I think we're very long way away from ever putting this into practice, but there has been some folks who create algorithms and compare the algorithm's prediction of who's dangerous with a judge's prediction of who's going to reoffend. And there are some believers that a algorithm would be better able than a judge to predict who should get pre-trial release and who shouldn't. And you know, I think that we could be going more that way in the future. I mean, that's less surprising things have happened.
Does it work?
Yeah.
That way?
Yeah.
Okay. When my husband and I moved to Silver City in, what year was it? 69. He decided to work here at Western and as district teacher. And before we came here, we got the local papers. We were living in Albuquerque University. And there was so much controversy about this woman, Mildred Cousy. And I just wondered why something like this could have been in the papers for so long, and she must have been in operation for such a long time. Why all of a sudden was it illegal, their whole situation, and do we have anything like this going on today?
You're talking about Madam Milby? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, through legislative action, it was made illegal. Prostitution was made illegal, right? And so I was going to say that as we were, the main presentation, you know, was reminding me how interesting our history is. And down at the Silver City Museum, there is a ton of interesting books about our history. There's a few on Madam Millie and the houses of prostitution that were booming in Silver City back in the day. And there's also a few books about sanctioned hangings, right? And the documented ones and stuff like that. So, yeah, I guess I don't know if I have a great answer to your question, Ray. But I just would say that something that strikes me was we were talking about the, you know, lack of history of Hispanics, right? Lack of recorded history. And I think it's interesting that that still very much is a case. We have a lot of interesting figures in the legal community, interesting cases, you know, interesting crimes that do not get formally recorded. And, you know, sometimes I think we have a lot of history that's being lost in Southwest New Mexico. And then also saying that it was, you know, controversial for Millie running her business, right? It was a salacious thing. And I think maybe in some respects that hasn't changed so much with women who are accused of committing crime. I thought it was interesting with Ada Holmes. I think that was the name. And it was framed as though she had an affair, right? Today we would call that rape if jailers had sex with her. It'd be sexual assault, right? But I think that when we see women who are accused of crimes or involved in crimes, you know, in some capacity, a lot of times we still do see media publications and even with, you know, how they're charged by the district attorney, overblown and made into a, you know, salacious thing.
From my perspective, I know of no underground House of Ill Repute in either Granton or Hidalgo County at this time. I'm unaware of it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That just means that I'm 60 years old and I'm unaware of it. I haven't had a case where there's been an allegation of prostitution in the years that I've been judge. It's going on 5. Okay. So the answer to that question is it hasn't come in that form. I've had a number of cases where sexual assault is alleged, but and there's an allegation that and somehow the defense is that the alleged victim somehow should have, you know, she consented. She's saying she didn't consent, and just be blunt about it. That you know that person, the victim, had any love. Doesn't matter. Sexual assault, sexual assault. That's where I see it, but I don't see it in Madam Millie. I think that was even before my time, and I'm like 60 years old when she was, because that would have been like the late 60s, early 70s. That's right. Yeah, and so I mean that's the issue there. I think was the issue of non-enforceability of not enforcing. I'm sure it was illegal. I'm sure it was. I'm sure that it's a law that could have been enforced, and I venture to guess that at that point in time, whatever it was with the powers that be, they chose not to enforce it. That's the way I see it. Is it right? No, but I don't think we have that now. I just haven't seen that. what I've been involved in all these years.
So I think we have time for only one or two more questions, and Doug has been waiting patiently up here. He's got a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in doing my research, I came across this problem with jurisdiction and so forth, and is that still an issue? You encounter that?
I'll speak at it as, because I was also the district attorney here for a while. So I'll look at that. The issue, we don't have a problem with jurisdiction, because if a crime is committed in the 6th Judicial District, then it's brought to us. But where the issue arises, quite honestly, is in what I call collaboration. Okay. There's always been issues involving collaboration, and it being my case. And I'm not telling you about the case, but that's been historic forever for quite a number of years. It's gotten a lot better as time gone on. I think that there's a lot better collaboration now between all of the departments than there were previous. But it's more of a collaborative issue. We'll work together to bring this versus, you know, it's our jurisdiction or jurisdiction. No, really, it's the jurisdiction of the court, the courts in that county. So it's happening in that county, then it's going to be brought where it's going to be investigated by who, whether it is. And I think that's where you get into the issue. It happened in the county, is going to do it. It happened in the city, so the city's going to do it. It can happen there, police is going to do it. And then you got the state police. But it does exist, because I can remember when I was district attorney, this was a long time ago. We had a murder out on the roadway between where the hot springs is, out there. Somebody, and I don't think they've ever solved it, but somebody just killed this guy. He was walking down the road and just killed him. And it was really sad. The guy was working. He was a worker who was just basically going to work at the ranch that he worked at forever and ever and ever. And he was walking to the ranch, and whoever drove by killed him. And it was very sad. But where we had the division we talked about is who's going to investigate it. The county going to investigate it, the police. Both have jurisdiction, right? The county has jurisdiction in anything that happens in the county. This happens in the county. The state police have jurisdiction over anything that happens in the state. It happens in the state. So then we had to decide which of the two was going to investigate, and I ended up making that decision. I picked the sheriff. So.
There is one off our Zoom. We've got a dozen people on Zoom joining us. So Dave Becker is asking, and it's probably for Doug. It goes back over 150 years again. He's asking, in the very early period of frontier justice, overlapped with the period of the wars against the Apache. And he's wondering if indigenous people were brought into the judicial or the justice system, or was it all dealt with by the military, or how did that?
Well, one thing that I can comment on there is the county commission in Grant County in the early 1880s offered bounties for Apache scalps. And it was an extreme reaction to warfare with the Apaches and raiding, that civilians did not believe that the Army or the law enforcement mechanism was dealing sufficiently with protecting the people. So they subscribed to the idea that the extermination of the Apaches would be a suitable solution to the problem. And they adopted this idea of proof of killing by offering money. And this is something, of course, the Mexican government had done very early on. And to the best of anyone's knowledge that I've ever seen, no one ever collected a bounty from the Grant County Commission for presenting an Apache scalp. But to the extent that that involves the legal system and the Apache issue, otherwise it was left in the purview of the Army and the Indian Bureau to enforce rule upon the native people.
I just thought I'd make a comment about the question of Millie. As someone who grew up here, and one of the reasons I think that in the paper a lot is it was pretty common for the press to print after the raid the names of the gentlemen that had been found out during the raid. And I mean, even as a child, I can remember when that would happen, and friends of my parents, one of the men had been caught at Millie's. So that may have been part of why it was always a topic of discussion, because literally the press would print the names after the raid.
One more question?
Going back to the pre-statehood territorial days, how did they determine who served in the justice system? What qualifications or experience led to people serving as judges or prosecutors or what have you?
It was very hit and miss in the territorial period. Most jobs in the territorial era were decided primarily through patronage. Basically, who, if you knew somebody, that you could get an appointment, and this was true right down to district judges. For example, if you were not affiliated with the Santa Fe Marine from about the late 1860s to well into, well, let's say 1900, if you did not have connections with the Santa Fe Marine, you were not going to get a territorial position. And down at the more local level, of course, who you knew was oftentimes localized, that you could get appointments to local positions by similar arrangements with local politicians.
Okay. Any final question? Yeah.
I have one very generalized question, and it may be inappropriate for this venue, but having lived elsewhere where police forces are not as broken up as they are here, where you don't have your public transport police, your university police, your local police, your sheriff, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering if you have would like to make a comment as to whether you think this system works better, or would we be better off with a more generalized single police force?
It really is. I mean, I never thought about that, but I've got to tell you, I probably would, at this juncture, lend or lean toward, and I need to think about this. I to lean probably toward, I like the fact that we have local departments, because I think that by having local departments, you have local people who know local people. One of the problems that you get when you have one generalized police force, you don't necessarily have, the chief of police in Barrett is Barrett. Which I don't know if the chief of police in Santa Clara lives in Santa Clara, but the chief of police in Silver live in Silver. And so I think that you get to know your people. And so you can do a better job, because I believe that life is about relationship. And you're able to deal with people that you know better than someone you know. And so my initial, I really didn't think about it a little longer. My initial thought, I kind of like. But that's a really good question.
Yeah, and I agree, it's a really good question, and it makes me think, I would tend to think a more generalized central power for healthcare would work, right? I've never thought about that translating to law enforcement. There would be some benefits. I think that the risk and red flag that jumps out at you is if there is corruption, right? There's no checks or balances, which I think would be an issue. So yeah, obviously I have to be biased, right? Because this is the water I swim in. But I think that like the answer to, or the cure for things that are lost in translation between departments and, the jurisdiction issues, or some departments that are under trained or under resourced, so they can't handle investigation, is that there just needs to be better collaboration and communication between departments. They should still remain separate.
Thank you, Spencer. Well, I think with that, we're going to conclude the program. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just to mention upcoming programs, we do have the Victorian Christmas at the museum on December 10th, so please join us for that. And Melody, our gift shop owner, wanted me to remind any museum members you get 20% off on a purchase of Christmas items. So thank you again, and thank you for the team. Thank you so much, Sarah, for handling the mic. Thank you, Javi and Marcus, for handling the technical. And it just truly takes a village. Thank you, Bart, for guiding these programs along. And of course, thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Dr. Dinwiddie. We really enjoyed your wealth of knowledge. And thank you so much, Judge Foy and Spencer Baca. So with that, thank you.